everyone. Welcome to the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Leadership Summit. We are glad that you could join us on this day of professional learning meant to take family-school-community partnership to the next level. My name is Tyler, and I will be this session's moderator. This session is session 6, partnering with families through special education, research-based strategies for special and general educators. And just to note that the session time has been shifted a little bit, so it will now be ending at 11:40. If you have any questions, concerns, or technical issues, please message me privately in the chat. So to ensure that we all get the most out of today, we ask that all participants turn off their webcams and microphones. If you have any questions for the presenter, please use the chat feature, and I will pass them along at an appropriate time. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Be sure to use the hashtag Breakthrough22 to share your thoughts. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's session. We have Dr. Kenyana Walker, who is a Senior Project Manager at the Center on Education and Training for Employment, CET, and serves as a co-chair of CET's Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, READY movement steering team. Her passion for education and equity led her to earn her PhD in school psychology from The Ohio State University. She is a nationally certified school psychologist, NCSP, and holds a 5-year practitioner license for the state of Ohio. Dr. Walker has experience in both public and community schools, where she used database decision-making while leveraging the assets of parents and teachers to identify and address the development, academic, and the social-emotional needs of both general and special education students. In addition to her experience with families and students, Kenyana has provided professional development to educators and parents on the topics of child find, twice exceptionality, classroom-based interventions, and effective strategies to connect to students. Dr. Gabrielle Hicks is a translational researcher at the Center on Education and Training for Employment, CET, where she works as a member of the Equity, Engagement, and Evaluation team. She possesses a longtime passion for the pursuit of equity, social justice, and systemic change in education, which led her to earn her PhD in educational studies with a focus on school psychology from The Ohio State University. She currently serves as a co-chair of CET's Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion movement steering team. Dr. Hicks' dissertation research emphasizes the urgency to prepare school psychologists and related school-based mental health professionals for the implementation of trauma-informed practices in urban schools. Her collaborative research on Black girls' counseling outcomes and the school-to-prison pipeline have been presented at national conferences for the National Association of School Psychologists as well as the American Psychological Association. Kiana Johnson, MA, is a graduate research associate for the Center on Education and Training for Employment. Kiana is a PhD candidate in school psychology at The Ohio State University. She received her master's in educational studies, school psychology in 2020. She has several research interests related to understanding the social emotional needs of Black girls and Black LGBTQ+ youth in school contexts. She has recently published 2 articles in school psychology journals, which discuss the linguistic demands of preschool cognitive assessments and the inclusion of Black children in behavioral interventions. Her dedications to implementing a social justice lens in academia stems from her work experience in urban preschools throughout New York City. I'll hand it over now to our wonderful team of presenters.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tyler. We are so looking forward to being a part of this today. And today we are presenting on partnering with families through special education. We'll be reviewing research-based strategies for special and general educators, and we'll show you essentially how you can access this resource, utilize it. We're going to be going through it. You may have heard already of the research brief that we conducted on this. So we are very much looking forward to diving right into this. As we get started, I just want to remind you of our learning objectives for today. So as you see, our main goals today are to explore, review, and investigate, exploring evidence-based recommendations and opportunities that we were able to develop and locate and put together for you all in a very concise way in the research brief. reviewing strategies to improve and bolster communication with families. So communication, you'll notice, is a thread throughout our presentation today. And so you'll be looking for that, and also how this applies to culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, our families from those backgrounds, and then investigating the necessary components to building inclusive, empowering, and consensus building IEP processes. And so we have an intentional focus on IEP as well, and we hope to just give you some tools that you're ready to use as soon as you walk out of here today. So the first thing we're going to do is some annotation. So I've got some instructions on the screen there. Look for the annotation icon on your Zoom bar, and this should come up once you click annotation or annotate. And then we're going to be using this stamp feature here. So if you can locate that very quickly, and just for a test of this process, go ahead and check out the scale below. And on a scale of 1 to 10, let us know how your week was. Okay, we've got a range. I see a lot of higher numbers. I saw a couple 3.5, 4.5. But it looks like most people are about middle to high. I relate with those on the 1 to 5 scale. Love it. Okay, well, everyone is here and ready to participate. So let's move on to this next one. On a scale of 1 to 10, how often in your practice do you consider family engagement strategies specific to special education? So how often are you all having this conversation in your schools, amongst your colleagues, related to family engagement specific to special education? Okay. Got a lot of 7 to 10, couple 5s, 4 or 5, okay. So we'd be really concerned if we saw a lot closer to 1, but I'm seeing at least it's a general conversation, and maybe in some cases it's a very intentional strategy. So we love to see that. Okay. Okay. All right. So we're going to jump into just introducing the literature review that we conducted, and I will set up for us to start talking about those strategies that we identified. So first, just an overview of the literature review. What you see on the left, if you have already downloaded the research brief, you'll know that that is the cover, that is the front page. And so essentially, we put together all of the strategies in here, but it started with us recognizing that special education requires schools and communities and service providers to really come together and partner with families to provide tailored services and supports and instruction for their children. So our goal behind this was recognizing that it's not as simple as just applying general family engagement strategies to those families of children with disabilities. It takes a little bit of a step further than that. There are certain things that are very characteristic of the experience of special education that require some adjustments to our understanding of family engagement, maybe some of our traditional strategies of family engagement. So Dr. Walker, Kiana, and myself started out this journey looking for research studies that highlighted specific family engagement strategies for those experiencing or going through special education. And so the practices incorporated 3 frameworks for family engagement. We'll get into those in just a little bit. And then also included recommendations based on IDEA. So we also did do an evaluation of IDEA and included some family engagement components that are required and discussed on the federal level. Full transparency, as we were doing our research literature review, we noticed that there is limited research right now that's very specific to these family engagement strategies for families of children with disabilities. So we started off with quite a wide pool, and as you can see, it boiled down to 30 studies in the end. We do believe that what we have to recommend to you all is concrete, and it is good information, but it's an acknowledgement that this is still a new or newer focus for literature. So you all can be a part of really championing this, and hopefully our strategies today will help you do that. So here's a brief overview of the 7 strategies that we will review today. The first being treating parents as experts and valuing their input. The second one is practicing culturally responsive family engagement. Third, practicing effective reciprocal communication. So as I said in the beginning, communication will honestly be a thread throughout all 7. You'll probably notice that as we discuss them. But we did include that as an intentional strategy because there were a lot of things related to reciprocal communication, what families have responded to in the past. Strategy 4, committing to inclusive, empowering, and consensus building IEP processes. Strategy 5, starting transition planning early and connecting families to services for all aspects of a full life. So really focusing, although transition planning is a part of the IEP experience, we really pulled that out because we saw some literature that was specific to preparing families of children with disabilities for that transition and starting early. Strategy 6, discuss supporting children and youth in their family engagement. So really bringing the student or the child along in the journey. And then strategy 7, we'll be talking about support for families by providing mentors. We have a very unique lens on that. Dr. Walker, Kiana, and myself all work on a project that will be discussed a little later that is a great model for how parents can be coached and mentored by their peers in order to really have a better understanding of the special education process and feel engaged and prepared. And now I'll pass it to you, Dr. Walker.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. I'm not sure if I'm experiencing some drag or if you're experiencing drag, but I'll keep watching folks' face to see if I'm the only one that freezes, and hopefully it's in a great light. As Dr. Hicks mentioned, we really wanted to spend some time in literature because we know that the experiences of students who receive special education is somewhat unique. And so sometimes we try to retrofit family engagement strategies that we use for the whole school district, the whole population, onto our students who are receiving special education services. And while there are some universal family engagement strategies that can cut across those types of experience, there are some things that are unique about our students who have disabilities and who are receiving services that we've not really been paying attention to. And so we really wanted to kind of sit down in the literature and understand what are the family's experiences, because we implement some of these strategies, and this is not to say that there aren't existing successful strategies, but we all know that many times in family engagement, sometimes the family is missing, the family is not centered. And so we were able to go and look at this literature and really understand families' experiences of the family engagement strategies that are routinely implemented as they are navigating the special education system. And so the reason why this was critically important for us is that, we understand in the state of Ohio, so getting down to a statewide context, that we have a lot of diverse learners in our state. We also know that the Ohio Department of Education, like many school districts, are very concerned about disproportionality. And for those of you who know, disproportionality basically really highlights the different experiences of students that are not similar to the experience of the average student population. And so we have some experiences that are disparate. And so we really wanted to think about how we could position literature to capture family experiences, but also bring it down in the context in Ohio, because more than 50% of our population in Ohio are considered diverse learners. And students with disabilities are one of those groups. But as you can see, we have students with disabilities that also fall into another group that's also considered diverse learners. And so we know that our family engagement strategies must be sophisticated enough to not just address the unique experiences and needs of our students with disabilities and their families and caregivers, but also some of the experiences that those students and families have that also fall into these other diverse categories of learners. And so this review of literature really allowed us to think about how we could identify best practices that cuts across many of these diverse learner populations. And so we really started with that. And then our desire was to, as Dr. Hicks said, start with understanding what IDEA says, start looking at the statutes and regulations. But we really want to push this conversation where we are not just thinking about those things, those are compliance level, things. And so a lot of our family engagement strategies are really aimed towards box checking and meeting compliance. But we really wanted to offer something that would allow us to exceed those requirements so that our families can have an experience in special education, those meetings, those processes that are similar to the rest. And for those of us kind of here that really, are engaged in the special education system day in and day out, we know that we really want to understand family experiences. But the federal government also wants to understand family experiences. And they are literally measuring that every year. And we are all getting graded on the extent to which families perceive that they are engaged at an appropriate level in special education, which is why we do want to move past just compliance. Some of you may know, Dr. Hicks alluded to this, our center assists in providing technical assistance for parent mentors, but we also assist with understanding parent involvement in their perceptions. Indicator 8 is a federal measure of parental involvement in terms of how families perceive their involvement to be in special education services. And for those of you that work in school districts or ESC, at some point in the next 6 years, your families will be asked to take a survey and to explain the extent to which they felt like they were involved in special education services and deliberations. This is an annual measurement that's conducted. It is a requirement that has been given to us by the federal government to do this, to understand that. And this requirement is really designed to enhance and improve services for students with disabilities. So it gives us kind of a snapshot every 6 years, because each district is put in a cohort, and every 6 years they're asked to disseminate a link to their families to figure out how they are doing. And so again, if you are in a district, your district either just completed the survey this year and last year, or your district will be included in one of those data collections in the next 4 years. And then another 6-year cycle rolls around and your school will be involved in that again. And so it's really important for us, number one, to understand how we're doing with family engagement with families of children with disabilities, but the federal government wants to know that as well. So it's critically important for us who are providing services, designing interventions, sending out those PRO numbers and all those other things and engaging in those conversations to know that there is a way to understand how families are perceiving this. But until we can pull that data down, we have a national representation of how families are experiencing special education. Mm-hmm. And it's in alignment with, 3 of the major family engagement frameworks that Kiana Johnson will talk about. And then we'll talk about how we overlay that into actual recommendations for these strategies. Kiana?
Thank you, Dr. Walker. So like Dr. Walker said, I will be talking about the family engagement frameworks that our review of literature made reference to. So I'll be speaking about 3 main frameworks. It's important to establish these frameworks before we speak about the strategies that we chose that we'll go into a bit later. So I'll be speaking about the dual capacity model, the Hoover-Dempsey and Sandler model, and then the Sunshine model. And these are really important and helpful in understanding the goals of family engagement and what factors of engagement influence positive student outcomes. So the first one that I'll speak about is the dual capacity framework. And this model is really helpful in understanding that families and educators probably have different experiences and perspectives of what effective practice looks like. And their backgrounds and exposure to education, or their exposure to the education system, will influence essentially their involvement in schools and their interactions with our students. And this is really important to consider when discussing the need for effective partnerships, which this model really focuses on. So the dual capacity model talks about how families and educators should be engaging in a reciprocal exchange of power in order to support each other's growth. There are 4 main areas that capacity is being built. And when we see that these are developed, we see improvements in our student achievement. So those areas are known as the 4 C's in this model. Those are capabilities, connections, confidence, and cognition. And again, the ultimate goal is to improve student outcomes and look to see how we can increase the level of support that our students are receiving. The next model that I'll talk about is the Hoover, Dempsey, and Sandler model. And this model is really looking to answer a couple of questions. So why do families become involved in schools in the first place? When they are involved, what are they doing to be involved? And then ultimately, how does this involvement positively influence our students' outcomes? So this model is pretty straightforward in that it's showing the relationship between what involvement looks like in student achievement. It's particularly interested in identifying positive characteristics. So it's looking at things like students' self-efficacy or self-regulation skills, also intrinsic motivation skills. So this model is really helpful in being able to identify what parent involvement looks like, and when it is frequent and active, how does that influence our students' achievement? The third model that I'll talk about is the Sunshine model. Sorry, one second. Is the Sunshine model of trusting family professional partnerships. This model is pretty unique because it is specific to families with children with disabilities. Families and educators are relying on one another to encourage a sense of belonging and resilience for students, which is really of the utmost importance for students that are beginning to navigate the special education process. So like the dual capacity model, the Sunshine model is looking to see how partnerships are influencing student outcomes. And this is at the center of the framework. Trust is intentionally centered. And in this instance, trust is just the confidence that both parties have, so families and educators have, that we are acting in the best interest of our students. So families are putting our trust in educators. Families are putting our trust in educators to make sure that they are making the best decisions when it comes to special education, so that our students are succeeding. And then educators are putting their trust into our families to make sure that they believe that families are doing what they can at home so that our students are being successful inside and outside of schools. I will hand it over to you, Dr. Walker.
Thank you, Kiana. So now that you all have kind of an understanding of the framework, the context as it relates to why it's important to exceed IDEA compliance, let's get into what you came here to see, and that is to really understand these evidence-based strategies. So our first strategy is really around understanding how we engage families. As we review the literature and really got to understand the family perspective, they often reported that their input was not valued. It was, in many cases, not even solicited. And so we know this is kind of a national review of literature, but it's likely that some of our families are also experiencing this type of engagement despite our best efforts. And so what we found is that literature highlights that many times educators, those of us who sit around the table who bring the data to these conversations, are most likely positioned as the experts in the room, not families. And when families do kind of assert their knowledge and expertise around their child's experience, we see this thing of assertion of knowledge going on. So that is where kind of as educators, we say something like, oh, I know, that type of thing. And so the first strategy is really designed for us as educators to really understand that we are all experts. As educators, we're experts in the process and those types of things and pedagogical practices and interventions and those things. But families spend a tremendous amount of time with our students. And they also have input to share. They have a position as an expert on a certain thing. For example, for those of us that are actually assessing students to determine their eligibility for special education services, we understand that we send documents home, that we interview families, that we do those types of things. We want to understand developmental history, medical history, background, when they walked, when they talked. So we know that families have an expertise that we do not have. And so this first strategy is really designed to situate everyone as experts who's around the table by being intentional in the ways in which we collaborate with our families and our caregivers. And that is really going back to the dual capacity framework, looking at two-way communication as the primary mechanism so that all the experts are on the same page, but also really developing a shared vision of what it is we're here to do and the services that we need to provide, and even a shared language around kind of what we are talking about so that we're not excluding families when we start getting into, the lingo that we use for special education. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But then lastly, using that two-way communication to ensure that we have joint problem solving, not where those of us who are a part of the district and educators are doing the problem solving and bringing the solution that we've identified to families, but that we are sitting around the table really thinking about what are some solutions we can put on the table as a team and really kind of chisel down to the ones that we believe will be the most effective for this student. And that requires a level of engagement with families where they are not recipients, but they are also co-collaborators of that. The second strategy really highlights what Dr. Khalif mentioned, and that is really engaging in culturally responsive family engagement. What does that mean? That means that we have a diverse population. We just saw that in Ohio, more than 50%. But that means that that diverse population has some knowledge about their culture, about their values, and those types of things. And for those of us that are providing services, providing education to these diverse populations, we really have to situate ourselves in some of these meetings and collaborations as learners ourselves. It is in those unofficial kind of conversations that we're able to cue in and really understand parts and elements of our students and families' cultures that they value and that are assets for them. And so recognizing, again, going back to strategy one, that they're coming in as an expert in some type of way with their student, we're able to be humble and say, okay, I need to learn this type of thing so that I can really connect with these families, going past compliance, but really engaging with them in the way that causes them to feel like they belong here and they are included here. And that goes to point two, and that is just increasing our own cultural competence. That list of diverse learners that we showed can really push us to really begin to understand what are the unique experiences of our students who have disabilities, who have this and are English learners, or who have disabilities and are gifted, twice exceptional, or who have disabilities and are whatever. And then as we learn, we can then kind of fold in some of those cultural approaches. So as we learn about our students and their cultures and the wonderful assets they bring to the table as a result of those cultures, when it's appropriate, we can think about that in terms of the interventions that we are putting in place, but even in terms of the way that we're setting up the two-way communication. And the last piece, when we think about feedback from families in this review of literature, is this whole idea around translation. We know it's a requirement for us to make documents and conversations as accessible as possible to families. And many times that means for our families who are bilingual or who are still learning English, that those documents be translated. But we also know that in the course of a school day, we take shortcuts, those types of things. But really getting back to that indicator 8, really getting back to engaging families as the experts. We cannot engage them effectively if the language that we are using is not accessible to them. And so really trying to do more than just our due diligence in making these documents accessible, and not always asking if they need it translated. If they need it translated the first time, let's just have them translated the next time that we engage with them, or bringing in someone else that can also interpret in the meetings that we are engaging families. And so the next strategy is then thinking about that reciprocal communication that I alluded to. So communication has to be something that we are intentional about. It's not something that should be organic. It's something that should be well thought through. So that means, as we're going back to strategy 1, really thinking about shared language, shared values, shared goals, that we are understanding how to engage in effective communication with all of the experts around the table. So that means sometimes we over communicate. Our communication is frequent. We want families to know that we're not just going to communicate with you about, special education notices and those types of things. We're going to communicate with you about everything. We're going to communicate with you about the successes that we are seeing as a part, or as a result, I should say, of our collaboration. And so that means that the communication is not just frequent, but it's very proactive. And we found in our review of literature that that was an extremely successful model that families valued, because they weren't informed at the end, and they weren't informed, 3 times a year or at every report card, but they were included and informed by being frequently communicated with, and in a way that was proactive. That also gets back to that joint problem solving. We know that as we engage in all of these special education things, that we can be compliance-based. We understand, Dr. Hickson and Kiana understand timelines. We've had to adhere to those timelines, getting those evaluations done, getting the meeting set, and those types of things. But there is a way to address compliance in a way that communicates genuine care and concern for our students, pausing to really see the family at the center of the work that we are doing. And that requires us to ensure that our families and our students feel a sense of ownership and belongingness in our school building, around our tables, in our hallways, that they see that the language that we are using and just the way that we're welcoming all families can include their family. And this goes back to strategy 2, being mindful of those cultural aspects, and how can we take those learnings to ensure that we're welcoming all of our families and all of their cultures that come with them. And then lastly, with strategy 3, just going back to intentional and proactive, but also deliberate activities and conversations that is centered around the student, not centered around our compliance, not centered around what we need to check on the box to make sure that we are within timelines, but that truly the activities that we engage in with these families are centered around them and not necessarily us as educators. And so those are the first 3 strategies that really are surrounding being kind of culturally responsive. And so now we're going to get into the meat of this whole idea of when we are prescribing services in the IEP. And I'll bring Kiana back in for that.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. So yes, so I'll be talking about some strategies related to the individualized education program process. So this first strategy that I'll talk about is committing to inclusive, empowering, consensus building, individualized education program processes. So in our literature review, we found that oftentimes parents express the IEP process to be very educator-driven rather than collaborative. And in that way, parents have been made to feel that their input is not as valuable. This is very far from the truth. Our parents and families are a part of our IEP teams. So the first step is emphasizing the roles of families on the IEP team. They should know how much their input matters. Just as Dr. Walker said before, our parents are experts when it comes to our students. And so they should be able to give advice, give their input and their knowledge within the IEP decision-making process. Using accessible written language for IEP documents is very important. This can look like translating documents outside of English for parents to use, but it can also look like minimizing the amount of jargon or educational lingo that we use in our documents. Taking a step back to say that this is not language that we might use on our day-to-day basis. So how are we defining these terms for our parents to fully understand what is being done in terms of the services that our students would be provided with? Providing tools for families to feel prepared to take part in the process. So here is an example of what a checklist might look like that kind of goes through IEP components. This is something that, again, families and educators can kind of collaborate on. This is something that they can bring to an IEP meeting because there is just a lot of information being thrown out usually in our IEP meetings. So maybe having a checklist will help with making sure that everybody is on the same page. And then welcoming differences of opinion. So this can be viewed as positive conflict, but allowing parents to actively participate in the IEP process may include some disagreements. But with that, you can work towards developing creative solutions that work in the best interest of the student. So welcoming those differences of opinion to make the best decision in a collaborative way. The next strategy is about transition planning, and this is kind of extending on the IEP process. So parents should be, and not should be, but they are a part of the IEP team, and so they should have a say in what goes on in terms of a student's transition planning. Using effective partnership skills is really necessary in developing a shared vision for the student. So educators and families should be working together to kind of develop this long-term goal for their student. When establishing these goals, it's really important to identify high and appropriate expectations for the student's future. We shouldn't limit what we think students will be able to achieve because of their disabilities, yet we should hold realistic standards. So keeping them high, but making them appropriate and finding out what tools are necessary in order for our students to be successful and be independent outside of their schools. Goals should be long-term, like I said, and then beginning transition planning as early as possible is very important. I made a note there that you can start transition planning in the state of Ohio at the age of 14 for our kids.
Thank you, Kiana. Kiana, someone's asking if you could potentially provide the link to the IEP checklist that we shared in the slides. I want to, Gabriel, can we go back to the last slide? Because I just want to really highlight the need to really think about transition planning. There is no law that says that we can't start this process, even these conversations early with families. I know that when we looked in that literature, there was a lot of confusion with families around what a transition plan was and those types of things. And a lot of confusion came in because those conversations were had right at the compliance date. But if we go back and shift family as experts, we understand that, you know, because they've been with their students their whole life, they have some desires and goals. they have talked to their students in ways that we just can't talk to them. And so they're able to really capture their child's desire for their life after school as it continues to mature with their age. And so it's a really good it's a really good time to think about how we can pull families in earlier, or at least start capturing that information, allowing them to start thinking about what it will look like for their child to transition, but also thinking about high yet realistic goals. Because we know that our kiddos can transition into many different areas of life. But we also know that research tells us that for many of our students who transition into post-secondary options like a 4-year institution, some of the information that families need to know to support that critical transition is not shared until the last minute. And so we have a situation where many of our students are now driving their services and driving the fact that they're now responsible to identify themselves. And what a great way to continue helping build family skills to support their students post high school by having some of these transition conversations very informally and very early. So I just wanted to throw that in. I just felt I needed to add that, because that was some critical information that we found, that families cannot participate in these conversations because they're not aware that they're going to happen and they've not been prepared for them. So thank you for indulging me, Dr. Hicks. And so something that's near and dear to my heart is this idea of peer-to-peer support for families. The Ohio Statewide Family Engagement. Yes, Gabriel.
I think we have one more slide for Kiana.
Did I talk all over you, Kiana?
Totally fine. Everything that you said was super.
I wanted to talk about these transitions. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. I think you made really great points. So thank you for adding to that, Dr. Walker. So the last strategy that I'll talk about very, very briefly is supporting children and youth in their family engagement. So just as parents are a part of our IEP teams, students are a part of it as well. And so we should be looking for tools that foster their self-advocacy. Students should be able to speak about what it is that they want to get out of special education, because their input is valuable. Essentially, they're experts on themselves too. So we saw in the literature that just as parents felt like things were educator-driven, students kind of feel that way as well. And so we should be making efforts to let students know that they are a valuable part of the team. So holding space for conversations is really important when it comes to students in special education. They are probably aware that they are receiving services, but they should be prepared and knowing about things like their disability category, components of the IEP process, certain terminology that might be said in meetings if they are in attendance, just being sure that we are prepping them just as we would any other educator that's sitting at that table when it comes to decision making. So holding space, acknowledging students as members of the team, and making sure that they know that they are valuable. So I will pass it on to you, Dr. Walker.
I wanted to stay muted until I was sure you were done. So going back to what I was saying about being near and dear, the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center just recently released one of their podcasts, and it was around families' experiences with special education. It was a great opportunity to really hear how some families were engaged in a way that really allowed them to have a sense of ownership and shared and co-creation of this process that they're involved in. And then we got to hear another experience where it was just not so. We know that both of those experiences are helpful in understanding how to make some refinements in the process. But what was telling about that podcast, and what I share about that now, is that we know that families of children with disabilities will share about their experiences, good, bad, indifferent, neutral. They just do. It's a part of their life, is what they're living, and they talk about it. And many times in their sharing, they begin to share with other parents or families or caregivers of children with disabilities. And we found this little nugget in literature that really talks about how parents are providing support for other parents or peer-to-peer support. And it's absolutely critical. It is critical because, as many of you know, and I know we have some parents on here of children with disabilities, that it can feel like a very isolating experience. It can feel like a very frustrating experience, especially if it's not a positive one. And so we see families building communities with other families who are also going through this process. And they're just giving out the support. They're ensuring that they're pulling in their people and making sure that they have the care that they need. But what we found was very fascinating around these peer-to-peer mentorship models. Number one is there's not a lot of models out there nationally that actually formalize these kind of care networks. We did find that Georgia Department of Education does have kind of a parent-mentor partnership thing, that they have a model that was formed some years back. It seems to be extremely successful, and family engagement is situated at the center of it. It is highly dependent on the dual capacity framework, where we're seeing that everybody's coming to the table as experts and folks are being valued. And if I enhance my skills, you enhance your skills, this whole process will be enhanced. But what Georgia has found is that they have made this a critical component of all of their family engagement. And they're finding a lot of success in it. They're finding that they're able to increase their contact and quality of contacts with their families. They're able to increase collaboration, which is something that we really want to do with families. But they're also able to do it in a way that it leads to school improvement and better decision-making on the part of school officials. And so it pulls families into those conversations in a way that did not exist prior to this program. The program is called the Georgia Department of Education. It's called Parent Mentor Partnership. If you Google it, you should find it. It's fascinating work that they're doing. And so because the research is limited and because we live in the awesome state of Ohio, we were able to really kind of sit back and really think about Ohio's model. Georgia's model, it is very formalized and it's very prescriptive. And as I said before, it aligns with the dual capacity framework. But many of you on this call know that Ohio has had a model in existence for 33 years, far exceeding the number of years that Georgia has had their peer-to-peer mentorship model in place. And Ohio's model, of course, is the Ohio Parent Mentor Project. And the Ohio Parent Mentor Project are really able to get some of those results that Georgia has been able to get. So the Ohio Parent Mentor Project, for those of you who do not know, I know I have some parent mentors on the call, shout out to you all, really allows parents of children with disabilities to formally mentor, to formally support, to formally guide other parents of children with disabilities. So this means that, you know, they are being brought into those conversations very early. We have found in some of the data that we collect on the program that many of the supports that parent mentors provide is prevention. And so that's even for our kiddos who may never make it into receiving services, who may never be identified as needing specialized services. Parent mentors, through their unique experience and expertise as a parent of a child with a disability, can help other parents and caregivers and families to really understand what it looks like to be in that seat of an expert of my child, but then also what it looks like to navigate these conversations, understanding, as Kiana mentioned, some of the language and lingo, understanding their rights and understanding the conversations that will be occurring as they go through this process. Becky, the program is called the Ohio Parent Mentor Program. It's funded by the Ohio Department of Education. We provide technical assistance and professional development to the parent mentors. It's a phenomenal program. Parent mentors are a very tight-knit group. Despite being very large, they are a very tight-knit group, but they are really positioned to support families, but also to support the educators and the other folks at the table. So as we're talking about pulling in the whole team, inclusive of the family. Parent mentors are there to provide school districts with an understanding of the parent experience. They're there to highlight some of the barriers that may be in place that maybe us with the school lens don't necessarily capture. But then they're also able to have conversations with families and help guide them. They're really kind of in the mix as a neutral party who's able to really pull together the threads of the experts such that collaboration, authentic collaboration and co-creation takes place. And we're very blessed to have that opportunity here in Ohio. So if you are working with families of children with disabilities, one of the best strategies that we can suggest to you if you are looking to have a parent mentor in your district and you do not have one is first to contact the Ohio Department of Education. But if you do not have one and you desire to do something today to pull together these organic kind of networks, is to really think about some of your families, some of maybe your longer standing families who have experienced your special education processes, deliberations, conversations, and those meetings. Think about those folks that really seem like they have it down pat, and think about a way to really work with those families to create a support for your families that are just beginning in this process until you can do something a bit more formalized. As I said before, parents are experts on their children, and they know what it feels like to experience these processes. They know what it feels like to experience them when they've been included, and they certainly know what it feels like to experience them when they've not been included. And I'm sure they have some great solutions and strategies that can be brought to bear to really think about how to assist all of your families in having the same or similar positive experience. Dr. Hicks, I'm going to hand it to you.
Okay. So you've heard a lot today, and we hope it was definitely effective and helpful for you. And we're going to leave you with some things to think about as you take your next steps. So I have a few things on the screen here. The first is you can really start by assessing your current practices and the engagement strategies that your school or even you yourself are implementing for families of students receiving special education services. It really starts with that evaluation piece to see where you are and where you can go. And actually, as part of the brief, there's an activity in the back on pages 17 and 18 to help you with that. So it's a reflections worksheet, and it has each of the 7 strategies over there on the left side. So after you've reviewed the 7 strategies in depth, and even the to-dos that we have listed or suggested practices that we have listed for each strategy, you can start to really put those things to work. So looking at your areas of success right now, there's a goals column where you can say, okay, we do this, this, and this already, and we're doing that well. And this is how we know we're doing it well. And then looking at your areas of improvement. So maybe even pulling out some of those suggested practices that we have listed that maybe you haven't tried or you'd like to try. So we highly suggest you utilizing that worksheet in the brief. And then just looking at this question here, how you can use or how can you use your knowledge of family engagement strategies to ensure inclusivity for families of students receiving special education services? So this is twofold. This is how we're bringing in the parents and validating their voice as experts, as we said, or including the child in their IEP process, in their transition planning. That's one fold of it. But then the other that we were very intentional about in this research brief is inclusion of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So making sure you're making those accommodations and that you're aware of the families that you're working with and allow them to use their voice in such a way where they are really a part of the process, but that you're really setting a platform for them to be able to use their voice. We really have to set the stage for that, because out of the dynamics of the relationship, typically speaking, educators, administrators, special education educators all have the power and hold the power in a lot of ways, in traditional ways. And so we've got to bring those families in and extend that power, right? Release some of that power and allow them the stage and the platform to join us in this process. And then lastly, be a champion. Prioritize family engagement strategies for families of children with disabilities. So when you get to your school team planning table and discussion and you're talking about family engagement strategies that we're talking about how we'll invite parents to this or include them in this. Make sure that we're intentional about conversations of including families with children with special education, that it's not an afterthought. It's not something that, we just have accommodations for, but that we're really intentional about utilizing these strategies from the get-go. So I have one more annotation activity for us, but of course our annotate isn't working for us today. So maybe just on a scale of 1 to 10, drop in the chat, how confident do you feel about your ability to take at least one step? Hopefully today, with all of the time we've taken, I hope at least one step comes to mind that you can take in the direction of improving your family engagement for families of special education. Seeing a lot of high numbers. Awesome. Thank you all so much for the feedback. And since we only have a few minutes left, I want to put this up. As you keep dropping your numbers in the chat, feel free to take a picture with your phone. Hold your camera up for scanning the QR code, or you can go to ohiofamiliesengage.osu.edu/research briefs, and you'll look for this image on the left. I believe right now it's at the top of the page, so you shouldn't have to look too far to find it. But you can download your copy for free. It has all of the information in there, all of the background and context that we talked about today, as well as that worksheet that you can utilize on pages 17 and 18.
Yep. So thank you, Kiana, Dr. Hicks, and Dr. Walker for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. Please join me in thanking them in the chat. And if this is your final session for the day, please be sure to take our survey by following the link go.osu.edu/summit survey. I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. We ask that you only take the survey once, so please do not take the survey until after the final session you are attending for today. So with that, I will put that in the chat. Surveys will be used to administer contact hours, so it's critical that you take the survey if you're seeking credit. The next session, a candid conversation on leadership, will begin at 12 p.m. Please remember to keep the conversation going on Twitter by using the hashtag Breakthrough22 and visit ohiofamiliesengage.osu.edu/summit for all information about today's events.